Foreign policy is a cornerstone of every presidential campaign. More than foreign aid or identifying our allies, though, a prospective president's foreign policy can be examined through a willingness or unwillingness to go to war. But ultimately, it's up to the public to decide, do we want more war? Well, according to a CNN poll conducted in late April and early May, the country is evenly split on just that. Do you favor or oppose the United States sending ground troops into combat operations against ISIS forces in Iraq or Syria? That question was answered with 48% said that they would support sending in ground troops to combat ISIS, but the other 48% didn't. When the question is framed to the public as fighting an evil enemy without the context, of course, that our own foreign policy is giving rise to terrorism, is it really that surprising that nearly half of Americans support more bombs? Now consider the candidates from our two major parties. Donald Trump, the Republican nominee who has vowed to send in ground troops to knock the hell out of ISIS, and Hillary Clinton, the Democratic nominee whose own ties to ISIS were recently exposed by WikiLeaks. WikiLeaks' Julian Assange says her emails indicate that she sold weapons to ISIS in Syria during her time as Secretary of State, and she's also made money from her ties to companies working for and funding ISIS. So Clinton, it seems, may be able to have her cake and eat it too by profiting from the very source of terrorism she both helped to embolden and promised to defeat. Trump, on the other hand, who has never held public office, so he has no voting record to examine. What he does have, though, is a never-ending string of comments that reveal him as a xenophobic racist. But he was not a fan of the Iraq War, even if only because it put his own business interests in jeopardy. And as Senator and Secretary of State, Clinton built a consistent and horrifying record of warmongering that destabilized dozens of nations while helping to create ISIS and fuel the very terrorism across the Middle East and Africa that the Democratic claims to want to fight. But it's her support and advocacy for the Iraq War, a war in which nearly 200,000 Iraqi civilians and 4,500 U.S. service personnel have been killed, that left a scar on Americans who at one point opposed war. Now, one of those fallen U.S. soldiers was Casey Sheehan, a U.S. Army specialist who died on April 4th, 2004. Now, in the wake of his death, his mother, Cindy Sheehan, became a vocal anti-war activist. In 2005, the Peace Mom camped outside of President George Bush's ranch in Texas for several weeks, vowing to stay there until she got a face-to-face meeting with the president himself, who she said never had a good reason for going to war in the first place. Now, she's been arrested during multiple anti-war protests in the years since then, and she also produces a blog and podcast, Cindy Sheehan's Soapbox, which tackles the U.S. empire that spreads war around the world. Now, she's here on Behind the Headline to talk to me about where the anti-war movement is today and whether any presidential candidate can bring that with them any hope for a world without war. Now, Cindy, thank you so much for joining me today. You've been extremely critical of the anti-war movement, and so have I, as we've seen them kind of jump on the Hillary bandwagon. Where is the anti-war movement today?
There's very little anti-war movement in the United States. There are some of us who are anti-empire, and we have been working against Obama and his wars, but it hasn't been a mass movement. It's been very small, and it seems to have been very localized. And there's been no mass demonstrations in Washington, D.C. against the Obama's wars. He's now bombing Libya. There seems to be very little opposition to that. And then, of course, Bernie Sanders just ran for the nomination of the Democratic Party to be president. His record in these, these issues are very bad. The only thing he can claim is that he voted against the invasion of Iraq when he had already voted to give George Bush authorization to use military force against the so-called war on terror. I usually call it a war of terror that the U.S. is committing against the world. And so all these people got behind Bernie Sanders, again, thinking that he was some kind of peace candidate. He rarely, if ever, addressed foreign policy. And if he did, he said things like he could use the unmanned aerial vehicles to drone bomb countries, like Barack Obama has done. And so all these people who I think would be more anti-war and more with us in the streets and at protests, they get co-opted by the Democratic Party time and time again. And the Democratic Party is just as hostile as the Republican Party.
Right. And speaking of pro-war candidates, with the presidential campaigns in full swing, you recently said You reflected on the two major party candidates, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. You asked, which is worse, background checks or a mass murderer? Are these really our only choices? And are the candidates any different than what we've had in the last 4 years or maybe 8 years ago?
Of course, Donald Trump has said things like he believes that people who want to immigrate to the United States from Muslim countries, Arab countries, should be subjected to more vigorous background checks than people coming from other countries. And although I oppose that, Hillary Clinton has been supportive of bombing Arab countries, and which has resulted, Arab Muslim countries, which has resulted in mass murder in Libya, tens of thousands, in Iraq, hundreds of thousands, Syria, Yemen, the list goes on and on. And of course, voting for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump is not our only choice. I prefer that people be out in the streets to have a mass movement to force policy change. And since we haven't seen that, you could vote, people on the right can vote for Gary Johnson, although I don't think his record's very good in speaking out against empire. People can vote for Jill Stein of the Green Party, although she's not really the nominee yet, but she probably will be. I'm voting for Gloria La Riva of the Party for Socialism and Liberation here in California. But voting's not the solution anyway. And like I said in the question about Sanders, a lot of progressive left-wing energy gets just sucked in presidential politics where there's very little chance of change.
Now, I want to jump into another conversation, another topic. I mean, as a mother who lost her son in the Iraq War, and as an activist who has confronted presidents and administrations and politicians on the military-industrial complex, what would you say to the Khan family as they lay out their grief on the public stage who criticized Donald Trump?
So here they are. They're saying something about someone who's a candidate, Trump, who hasn't made any policy decisions or policy votes, but they're supporting somebody who really, I think, has been very destructive in her public life.
Right, and I'm glad you talked about that because, this leads me to my next question is, what would you say to Donald Trump, whose response to the Khazir and Ghazala Khan couple, the parents of the Muslim soldier, like your son who was killed in Iraq, has been nothing short of disgraceful?
It's like telling my 5-year-old grandson he should apologize for something he's not sorry about. I'm not sure Donald Trump is sorry about what he said. However, like I said before, Donald Trump, his question to them was, why are you mad at me? Hillary Clinton voted for the war that killed your son. And so why aren't they demanding that Hillary Clinton apologize for that vote? And so I think it's just a media controversy that isn't focused on the correct thing. Donald Trump has extremely belligerent rhetoric. I think somebody should take away his iPhone so he can't tweet anymore. When I was in Crawford, Texas in 2005, and when I was doing, my activism, I'm still doing it, but when everybody was focused on my activism, when the corporate media was focused on it, they said that George Bush was kind to me, that George Bush said, that she has a right to her opinion. But George Bush had Karl Rove, and Karl Rove and his minions attacked me thoroughly. So I just think, and I've said, if the Khans really believe in their cause, then they shouldn't care what Donald Trump says about them. And Donald Trump, I don't really understand how he became the nominee for the Republican Party in the first place, but he really just needs to think twice before he sends those despicable tweets out into the universe. Once they're out there, you can't pull them back.
Well, Cindy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thanks. It was great to talk to you.
Talk to you soon. Thank you.